Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon for everybody who's joining us from different parts. So, welcome to another session of the Early Career Researchers Forum by the Young Scholars Initiative, South Asia Working Group, and the Economic History Working Group. Thank you for joining today. Today, we have been joined by Dr. Surbhi Kesar, and I request my co-organizer, Satvik Vishwas, to introduce Surbhi to our audience.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you very much. This series we have been organizing for a few years now already with different names, but the main idea is that we try to listen to and engage with early career scholars who are working, often path-breaking, not always recognized that much. Some are, others are not, but path-breaking work in the area of social sciences, particularly economics, but also interdisciplinary in nature. Today, we are thankful to have Surbhi Kesar, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics, SOAS University of London. She is a development and political economist who is currently working as a senior lecturer, like I said, at the Department of Economics at the SOAS University of London. Her recent work and ongoing work focuses on labor and informal economy, very important for South Asia and India and the global South, and the production of the structure of economic dualism in India with high economic growth, thereby critiquing the imaginary of development as capitalist transition, relation between identities and social exclusion, political economy of crises, a critical engagement with social reproduction theory, and approaches towards decolonizing the field of economics. If you have been following Surbhi's work, you must have noticed a recent paper on decolonizing economics. Her research is embedded in the Marxian political economy and South-centric critical frameworks of economics. We are very lucky to have you. Thank you very much for your time, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Satvik and Arun. And what I can do is I can begin by sharing my screen. So if there are any questions of clarificatory nature, please just feel free to put it in the chat and I'll keep an eye on it and you can ask me. And for anything that are more substantial, we can probably have the discussion towards the end. So what I'm going to talk about today is the role of informal economy in the process of economic development. And this is something where sort of as we're thinking about this role, I'm drawing from different works that I have done and also with my co-authors, and I'll signpost all of that as we go ahead. So let's sort of dive in straight. This is the roadmap, but let's kind of skip it and go ahead. Let's see how much of this we can get through. There's supposed to be sort of a theoretical overview of this question, the various debates in terms of how to think about this question. How is the mainstream of economics thinking about it? How are the more critical literature in economics thinking about it? And we're also going to advance some radical political economy frameworks that I personally find most convincing to make sense of this issue. And of course, as we go through it, I'm going to draw illustrations from about 3 different works to kind of speak to that. But let's see how many of those illustrations we can go through. And I'm happy to put the ongoing work and articles in chat if that might be helpful. So let's start with what the problem is. And we're dealing with this, sort of center of the issue of economic development in much of economic theory, wherein a developed versus a less developed economy is seen to be distinct in its economic structure, where a less developed economy is characterized by what we can refer to as an economic dualism. Why is it dual? Because there is a coexistence of a huge traditional or agricultural or pre-capitalist or informal segment alongside a much more modern industrial capitalist formal sector. The former absorbs much of the labor force in the economy, while the latter is a much smaller segment of the entire economy. On the other hand, the economic structure of a developed economy is a non-dual, or what we can refer to as a homogeneously modern structure. That is one that is characterized mainly by this modern industrial capitalist formal sector. Over time, the expectation of development is that there'll be interrelated process of structural change in the production, employment, and economic activity in order to transform the economic structure of an economy from this dual economic structure towards this homogeneously modern one along the lines of advanced capitalist economies. Now, why is this vision Eurocentric? Because it imagines, or it expects, that the imagination of how development happened in the global north will be something that will be also mapped out in the global south. But not just that, the vision of how it happened in the global south, the north, is also partial because it doesn't take into account the role of colonialism and various other forms of structural oppression that led to that sort of capitalist transition in the global north. So A, that vision itself is partial, and B, the expectation is that this is almost something that can be re-aped by, let's say, the global south economies, which are dual. However, by around 70s, 80s, there came to be this recognition amongst international institutions and general academia that actually, even as people were moving out of, let's say, what were the agricultural and the traditional livelihoods, they were not really getting absorbed in these modern formal sectors of the economy, right? And this is something that has come to be accepted even in the mainstream of literature today. And what really started to happen was that the same sort of production structures that existed in the traditional and agricultural sector started to be reproduced even in the urban industrial segment. What were those livelihoods like? Most of them were basically what McGee characterizes as peasants in the cities. So it was usually family-based production. Even though production is happening for the market, it was mainly subsistence-driven. There was no wage labor, etc. Now, this sort of economy and this sort of economic production processes can be seen pretty much in the global south economies as you just walk out on the road, right? Like imagine a small mechanic at the side, at the curb of the road, or imagine a banana seller on the cart, so on and so forth. So this is sort of what the landscape of many of these economies look like. So Indian economy, which is sort of the illustration that we'll be using today, it is characterized by a persistent informality despite very high and sustained economic growth. And this, despite high and sustained economic growth, is going to be something that's important for us, and I'll get to it in a while. Informality is characterized by precarity, poverty, and vulnerability. It's of course not a monolith that, it's all homogeneous and informality can only be characterized in one way, but rather it is something where it comprises, broadly can be seen of its two parts. One is informal wage employment. That is everybody who is in wage employment without long-term job contracts. And the other part is the informal sector, which is usually, statistically, it is characterized by enterprises with less than 10 total workers, but that's more a statistical definition. For theoretically, if we have to think about it, think of it again in terms of subsistence-driven, family-based enterprises that do not employ wage labor. In fact, much of the Indian economy of its informal sector is characterized by such sort of enterprises, and I'll show you a graph shortly. The question is that why, whether this expected path of development via this transformation has been bearing out in the Indian case or not, whether there has been a tendency towards it. And if not, we need to rethink the process of economic development in the global south, particularly given that this huge informality has not just persisted, but it has become very pervasive in different types of employment relations in the country. So let's kind of have a look at the total Indian workforce. This is the data from using periodic labor force survey and also the economic, drawing some of it from the economic census. But let's sort of just look at agriculture. 46% of Indian economies in agriculture workers. Then when we look at the non-agricultural sector, 14% informal, but the rest, which is roughly about, a little over 40% is in non-agricultural informal sector. So actually, much of it is an informal sector, either in agriculture, because much of agriculture is informal, and non-agriculture. What we're going to focus on today is sort of parts of all of these sectors, and wherever I'm distinguishing, I'll kind of point to it. So this is the scale that we are talking about. So what we sort of think as like non-standard work relations, etc., is not just non-standard, it's the most standard form of employment as we know it from much of the global south, right? So how is it that the different strands in literature have tried to make sense of it, that why this informal economy persists, what is its role in the process of economic development? So within the mainstream, we can broadly classify into two views. One is the dualist view and the other is the continuum view. What does the dualist view says? It basically says that this informal sector is sort of a temporary holding ground for the excess labor force, which would be absorbed with an expansion of the growing capitalist segment of the economy. Now, one thing that I kind of want you to keep in mind, because as I keep using these terms, I don't want it to cause confusion. But broadly, if you're looking at the informal economy, there's the wage employment component of it. Those that are employed in wage employment, but under without any long-term social security benefits or contracts. And the other one, the informal sector, as we're talking about, which is what I said with these smaller enterprises. The literature also refers to much of these enterprises as what are called the non-capitalist segments of the economy. Why non-capitalist? It's all under capitalism, just to be clear about it. But they call it the non-capitalist segments because there is an absence of a capital wage labor relation, and it's not directed by the profit-oriented accumulation logic. So basically, that's what I'm talking about. So even if I use these terms interchangeably, please keep that in mind. And the dual view sort of kind of agrees with this idea that, look, there are these two distinct sectors in the economy with very different structural logics to it. One is this sort of formal versus the informal sector. The two are quite different in their productivities, in their earnings, in their economic logics, where one is mainly driven by subsistence, whereas the formal by profit-oriented logic, and there's better technology, etc. And the idea is that we need various kinds of interventions and high economic growth such that this transformation can be brought about. There's a second view, which is the continuum tradition, which basically says actually these two sectors, formal and informal, cannot really be seen as having two distinct economic logics. They're quite similar. The smaller firms are just small, but they are as micro-entrepreneurial and dynamic as the big formal firms. They just face stricter constraints to growth, so you need to help alleviate that growth. But in a sense, they're actually similar enterprises, even if just different in scale. And therefore, they basically consider the point of a structural transformation as moot. It's just a random draw of productivity distributions. All you need to do is release the constraints of growth. Either way, one thing that remains similar across both these strands is one about bringing about this transition with economic growth. However, in much of this, what kind of gets lost out, and something that I'm trying to develop in this ongoing work with Snehashish Bhattacharya, is trying to think about that this is actually not a unilinear process of transition as it exists in much of the global south. Rather, there is something which is a contradiction between an expanding capitalist segment of the economy and the non-capitalist segment of the economy, which is what a lot of the informal economy is. So both on a global scale and on a domestic scale, the capitalist expansion that has happened in a way that there has been a contradiction between the growing modern capitalist segment and the pre-existing traditional non-capitalist segment. Historically, it happened with colonialism, which led to the creation of the core economies and the peripheral economies, where the core economies growth dependent on extraction from the peripheral economies in vast parts. So this process of development and development in the core and underdevelopment in the periphery was brought about through a common process, right? Which is what a lot of dependency theorists would also argue. And here we want to say that it's not something just which has an international dimension, but is also something that is a part of the development process domestically within an economy, where this high growth is something that is linked with in a contradictory relationship with much of this informal sector. Now, this sort of contradictory relationship has actually been explored in various critical parts of the literature. I'm not going to get into a lot of it, but basically the idea is that these sort of informal non-capitalist spaces are required to remain small so that they can provide cheap wage goods and lower the labor costs, lower the wages, etc., of the growing formal sector. So in that sense, it's economically needed for the growing capitalist segment and the growing formal capitalist segments for some sort of an impoverishment, if possible, of the informal sector. And then, of course, there are other perspectives. We're not, again, going to go into all of them. But for example, if we look at Harvey's idea, David Harvey, where the idea is that these spaces are something that provide as ways or provide as avenues for when there is over-accumulated surplus in the capitalist segment to be invested here in order to be able to make profits, right? But what we're going to focus today here is the intervention by the works of Kalyan Sanyal, which as I had suggested, is going to be sort of the key theme of the lecture today. And here the idea is that within a domestic economy, even, there are those international dimensions of imperialist subjugation, etc. But even keeping that aside or keeping that as a complement to it, what our focus is the domestic dynamics of the growth process. And herein, the idea is this, that the capitalist growth is such that it encroaches upon in its growth process, it encroaches upon the various non-capitalist segments, but it does so without absorbing the people who depend on these. So let me kind of reframe it. The capitalist growth process happens in a way such that it transfers resources from the non-capitalist segments within its ambit. However, even when it transfers resources, the people that were subsisting on these resources, let's think about land and agriculture, it doesn't absorb these people in this entire process. Now, these population that is dispossessed from their resources, as well as those that, and also are not absorbed in the growing capitalist segment, are excluded and need to recreate their conditions of livelihood in these informal non-capitalist segments, and thereby in the process reproduce the segments. So what we see as the persistence of this informal sector is not something which is needed, but rather this strand would say that much of it is actually economically redundant for the growing capitalist segment or the formal capitalist segment, but continues to persist because it actually doesn't, it actually is not able to absorb them. Why should this still exist? It should still exist because, in whatever form of democracies that we live in, you can't really just let these people die, right? So you have to provide for certain spaces of existence. So in that sense, the space serves more like a political need for the systemic stability rather than some sort of an economic need. Such segments are driven by the logic of economic subsistence, again, operating through market and everything, but in terms of mainly driven by ensuring the satisfaction of household subsistence need rather than being accumulation oriented. Right, so already spoke about the political need. In here, when you think about the development process as it exists today, where we are more and more moving away from this idea of structural transformation, and there's a lot of focus on microcredit loans, transfers, etc., that is in fact something that ensures the reproduction of these particular spaces in absence of which you might actually have a militant workforce in your hand. And this is something that we did sort of see with the farm laws when more land was being taken away from these people in order to liberalize agriculture in the Indian economy. What we did see was there being a backlash because there's actually not good jobs available for people. So you need to allow for them to subsist on these segments, be it agriculture or non-agriculture, so that it doesn't become politically unviable for the system. And in doing so, this particular framework breaks away from this teleological narrative of structural transformation, where global south is just some sort of a distorted pattern of development in the global north, which will eventually come to pass with high growth. We're taking a high growth economy, which is India, and we're saying that actually this entire segment is reproduced. And the mechanism that we are thinking about it is exactly through this process of growth that has become much more capital intensive and that is continuously dispossessing these people without absorbing them. Right. So what I'm going to do today is kind of talk about three different illustrations from the Indian labor market to sort of identify some reflections of this process. Of course, the idea given, unlike very micro questions, when you're dealing with these broader political economy questions, it's always not possible to prove to the T of exactly this is the mechanism that's playing out. But the idea for this entire research program that we're trying to develop is to provide illustrations for different parts of it. And hopefully when we're done with doing that, we can kind of convincingly argue that, look, this fits the story, this fits the puzzle in some way. So I'm going to talk about, let's say whether we have time for three illustrations, but the idea would be the first of them will be based on India's Human Development Survey, which is a panel data over 2005 and 11-12. And I'm going to analyze the transitions of households in terms of where is it that they derive their primary income from. The second one is going to be from a work that I'm developing with Rosa Abraham, using the CMIE data, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, which allows us to see these transition in the very recent period of 2017 to 2019. And it's a very high frequency data set. So basically you see people transitioning every 4 months. So we're going to see that. And finally, I'm also going to show you, if we have time, something from labor force survey data to kind of show that how these processes that I'll be talking about are highly co-constituted by the aspect of caste. And in fact, much of this sort of framework that I talked about, one of its big lacuna is that it doesn't take into account caste, despite caste being one of the most constitutive process of the Indian political economy landscape. So that's basically the three illustrations, where we're going to kind of think about what are the micro level changes and transitions that underpin what is sort of happening under this broader process of change and transformation. So let's start with sort of the first one. We're looking at the 2 rounds of India Human Development Survey data. This is from 2005 and 11-12, but basically captures the high growth phase of the Indian economy. It's a panel of 40,000 households only observed over 2 time points. The transition is defined in terms of a shift of a household across the sectors in terms of its primary economic dependence. Now, of course, I'm going to divide the whole economy into various sectors, but you don't necessarily need to remember all of them. I'll keep, sort of signposting wherever it's needed. So basically, it can broadly be divided into lower tier informal and upper tier informal or formal. We have to create these categories because of all the heterogeneities within the different sectors. The lower tier, the informal, is basically agricultural self-employed. This is your informal self-employed in agriculture. Then you've got the non-agricultural self-employed, which is again the non-capitalist self-employed households in the non-agricultural sector. Then we've got casual wage labor, which is usually wage payment on a daily basis, either in agriculture or non-agriculture sector. And all of this we're categorizing as the lower tier of the informal or the broadly the informal sector economy that we talk about. Then there's an upper tier, which will have the non-agricultural employers, that is those who basically hire wage workers. And then we have salaried labor, basically. Again, some part of this would not have long-term job contracts, but this is the best that we can get from the data. So it's sort of, some sort of an overestimation of formality. So let's kind of look at what these sectors sort of tell us about the structure. Now, one thing that I just want you to focus in is that this is simply telling the proportion of households that receive their primary income from a particular sector in 2005, and the proportion in the purple color are the proportion that receive the primary income from that sector in 11-12. Barring some differences, there has not been a major shift, which is something that we expect given that it's a short time period. So we're not like expecting something huge to happen. But let's sort of just look at transitions. What does this mean? In this graph, I'm simply showing the same sectors as earlier, but the proportion, the brown graphs are, the brown vertical bars are showing the proportion of households that transitioned away from that sector between 2005 and 11-12. And the purple graphs are showing the proportion of households that transition towards that sector between this period. So let's just look at non-agricultural self-employed. We didn't see a change in the overall proportion of people in non-agricultural self-employed, which is our non-capitalist informal sector in the non-agriculture sector. Fair enough. However, 68% of people who were deriving their primary income from non-agricultural self-employed transitioned away from that sector by 11-12. But concomitantly, about similar proportion from other sectors transitioned towards it in this period. So overall, you see that the sector's composition has not changed, what we talk about India's stunted structural transformation, but underlying it is this huge proportion of transitions as households, and this is something that maps up in the labor data as well, is this huge proportion moving across different sectors of the economy. But still, it's almost like as many people who move out is balanced by the number of proportion of households that move in, and therefore keeping the overall segment constant. Now, I'm just looking at the proportion that transitioned out of non-agricultural self-employed, and we see that they're moving towards all other sort of sectors. There's a lot of people who move into casual wage employment and then sort of come back, but that is something that we do see happening across different sectors. It's not just driven by one sector of the economy. So some of the key things that we see from here is that in spite of high economic growth, there's a simultaneous disintegration, but then again a reconstitution of this informal economic spaces. So the informal spaces are not just sort of pre-existing vestiges of the past that have not been able to transition. Rather, they are continuously regenerated through this mobility. So it's not a stagnant process through which the stunting is happening. Rather, it's underlying this huge churn in the economy that is actually going on. Now, what are the nature of these transitions? Are they good transitions? Does this actually mean that, we are onto something good and we're going to, be able to, through this process, also move towards something that is more desirable? I do a simple exercise. I'm not going to walk through all of it, but I'll kind of tell the intuitive logic of it, and I can come back to it if there are any questions. But simply, I look at the average per capita consumption level of the household, and and if we just look at sort of the hierarchy, this is as expected, where at the lowest end you have the households with the casual wage labor as their primary income source. Then, of course, in the middle, you've got, the self-employed in non-agricultural and agriculture. And in the upper end, you have the salaried and the employers. However, what we do is we try to find out whether the transitions that these households were undertaking were favorable or unfavorable. And to do that, we do a very simple sort of exercise where we identify for every sector. Let's say we start with people who are in non-agricultural self-employed in period 1, right? And we basically look at households that did transition out of it and those that did not transition out of it by 2011-12. We simply look at the returns to characteristics for households that did not transition, what was their returns to characteristics? If those same returns were imputed onto households that did transition, and estimate what their predicted per capita consumption levels would be. Where simply the idea is, had these households remained in the sector and had similar returns to the characteristics as those that did not transition, what would their average per capita income would be? We do this exercise and get sort of, and of course, the characteristics used for predicting their consumption is caste, religions, years of education, loan taken, proportion of adults in the household, area of land owned, state zones and sector, rural, urban. And what we basically find is something that is sort of expected to kind of show that despite all this movement, the stratification between these different formal and informal sector has remained very strict. So, for example, if we just look up, let's say, those transitioning from non-agricultural self-employed, which was non-capitalist self-employed sector, to non-agricultural wage labor, the minus sign simply indicates that their returns or their predicted income would have been better had they were able to have the same returns that the households that did not transition have. So these are the households that transition to non-agricultural wage labor. And if they had not transitioned, their returns would have been similar. But now let's just keep in mind, on average, almost in India, the consumption levels are rising for all sectors of the economy, right? So this is in terms of what would have happened had they not transitioned in some way. But of course, the question can be that, look, they probably transitioned because they were very different sort of households than the ones that did not transition. And we try to take into account by sort of doing some reweighting using Dinado-Lemma reweighting, Fortin-Lemma reweighting, where simply the idea is that rather than comparing it to the entire set of households that did not transition, we only compare it to the households that in period one, based on the characteristics, would have been as likely to transition. So you reweight them higher, and what we find is similar results. We do a bunch of other things by increasing the standard errors by a few time points, and it again stays similar. So I can talk you through robustness check if needed, but simply the idea that I want to keep here is that with all this movement, there is parts of the literature who say, look, that actually means that the labor market is very integrated. So this is a good thing. But despite these movements, those segmentations between different tiers of formal and informal sector have remained very, very strict. But it's just that this duality is now much more heterogeneous and much more complex for us to make sense of. From that exercise that I did, we find actually 62% of these transitions were in fact unfavorable. That is, if these households had not transitioned, the returns to their characteristics would have been much higher in the sector from which they started off. Yeah, these are the robustness checks, which I'm going to switch over. I'm going to just quickly tell you what is the highlight of this particular exercise is before I move on to the second illustration, because I'm also keeping a time on the an eye on the time. And here we're simply basically trying to look at the characteristics which inform these household transitions, like what are the household characteristics that do matter? Of course, education usually comes across as an important correlate, etc. But few other things, which is something that are often kind of, are not a part of the characteristics that can be chosen, is something that comes up. So what I do is, whether you undertake these different kind of transitions using a multinomial logit estimation, we regress it on a whole host of characteristics, and what we get as important ones are years of education and also whether you're in rural or an urban area. But one thing that really starkly jumps out and not unexpected in the Indian case is the social caste of the household, wherein, for example, on average, other backward caste households in a non-agricultural self-employed sector are 3.2 percentage points have a lower probability to transition towards an employer's set. So that's sort of just something I want to say in passing, and I want to come to caste much more in detail later. So let me show you a second illustration. This is now based on the CMI data analyzing recent labor market transitions, and we'll find some very similar story. This is not something that is just like 2005 story, but something that happens, and we're able to excavate a little more out of it. To do this, what we simply do is a trajectory analysis, wherein rather than like an earlier case of imposing and understanding these different transitions, we basically let the data tell us what are the big patterns that emerge out of it. So you've got so many transitions that are happening that we saw earlier as well. But now, since we have multiple time points of data available, what we can do is we are able to be like, okay, how do we make sense of all these people moving in all these different directions, as I was saying? So we try to identify what are the most dominant trajectories that emerge out of all these random movements that we're basically seeing. To do this, we basically use a trajectory analysis, which is a group-based modeling of development, and allows us to group different people together based on similar development trajectories that they have. This is what we get out of it. Okay. Now, this is quite interesting in terms of what are the main trajectories that people follow. Zero is, so this is only for set of people who have ever been employed at least once over the 8 time points that we study. It's 8 time points between 2017 and 2019. And the x-axis is basically the time points, and y-axis is the different types of employment arrangements. 0 is unemployed. 1 is casual wage employment. 2 is salaried but temporary salaried. So you can think about domestic workers. It's like you pay them salary on a monthly basis, but they do not have long-term job contracts. 3 is self-employed, and 4 is permanent salary. Those with white-collar workers with long-term job contracts, etc. Now, what I want you to think about is that what is the most dominant trajectory that emerges out of it? I mean, these are the dominant trajectories that emerge out of our data. And one thing that's quite clear is in this lower end, this huge amount of flux, again, people moving across different employment arrangements between different kinds of informal employment arrangements. At the top is this only 6.7% of the entire population, which is consistently almost always in permanent salaried. Another important thing that I want you to notice, another important trajectory is always self-employed, which is 38% of the people. Okay, so these are the non-capitalist segments that we were mainly talking about. The black line is those people who are able to transition from informal wage employment towards informal self-employment. I want you to keep in mind as I draw some key inferences that we come out of it. One, in the Indian economy, there's an absence of a job ladder. What is the job ladder argument? It's simply that the role of informality would be one of providing better skills and better experience to people, and it's sort of an entry job which allows you to then move up to permanent salary job, right? Whereas what we find here is that mostly if you enter into the workforce as permanent salaried, you remain permanent salaried. It's not that there's a job ladder from informality to climbing up and to moving to formal employment, which is how it is expected in a developed country context. An individual is as likely to enter into permanent salaried employment from out of the workforce as from some sort of a temporary salaried employment. From casual wage employment, it is even much lesser. Majority of workers who were in permanent salaried in any given point in time continue to be in permanent salaried in another point in time. There's a high degree of precarity for most wage employment. In fact, we see people who are in these trajectories, which which are sort of this bottom end of informal wage employment. There's a huge amount of switches that happen, and given that much of it is not towards an upward transition, they're mainly indicators of precarity. One thing that I think is quite interesting, and I want to sort of focus on a little bit, is the role of self-employment. And it's quite interesting that self-employment is in fact income-wise even better than a lot of casual wage employment that we're basically seeing. It's one of the stable trajectories. Of course, it's still much lesser than the salaried people, but it's sort of better than these informal wage employment trajectory, which makes the case quite interesting. Why so? Because if we go back to our initial models of development following Lewis that we talked about, the idea was that people would voluntarily move out of self-employment towards wage employment. This is not to argue that self-employment is suddenly now becoming a good employment. No, not at all. It's still a high precarious, low income trajectory. However, the wage employment has now become so much worse off in majority of the ways that it exists that self-employment is in fact better than something like this. So, in fact, self-employment allows a better likelihood to transition to permanent salary than any sort of other informal wage employment transitions. So, the development model in terms of what role these transitions were supposed to play, which was supposed to be voluntary, and where self-employment was supposed to be such sort of a disguised unemployment through which people will move up through the job ladder, is sort of inverted on its head. We do not see that transition happening. We do not see a movement into formal salary. We see a huge amount of transition in the Indian economy, but much of it is sort of tend to be driven much more by need rather than by a voluntary movement. In fact, this is again a simple exercise where for these different trajectories, we just try to see that where is it that these people would maximize their earnings, in which trajectory, because many people would say, oh, they're in informal because they just have lower education or they don't have enough experience and those sort of things. So we're like, actually, let's just see, based on the returns that people get to their different characteristics, all of them would be much better off in permanent salary. So they're not optimally choosing these different informality things just because they have low education and low human capital, etc. And that is something that comes out quite starkly for us. Now, as I can see, I do not have time to go to the third illustration. So I'll sort of start to conclude it and kind of give you an indicator of the third illustration, and which, we can pick up probably at another point in time. What we see overall is the substantial proportion of household and labor market transitions in the Indian economy. But despite that, the overall structure has continued to remain more or less intact. There's a continuous reconstitution and regeneration of different economic spaces, including informal sector and casual wage employment, which were often expected to dissolve with growth. And much of it is unfavorable transition. And like we also see, people who are in informality, despite there being a lot of people moving towards it, it is not that they are maximizing what they would be getting for the characteristics that they have. So it does not imply an integration. Informality is not a job ladder. The transitions do not imply an integrated labor market, but rather these distinct economic segments continue to remain strictly delineated and structured and fragmented. But rather than these broad binaries that we started out with, the duality has become much more complex. It is with this embedded dynamism in the process that the fractured economic structure of Indian economy and the non-capitalist spaces and conditions of informality that were supposed to go away with economic growth are being continuously regenerated rather than due to lack of them. We depart from much of the mainstream as well as non-mainstream strand that tend to oversimplify the process by basically saying, look, the growth process has just bypassed a vast section of the population, or saying, look, it's all inclusive and people are micro-entrepreneurial and they'll get sort of absorbed in this entire process. There's some resonance with what we started out with Sanyal's exclusionary growth thesis, where the excluded population is forced to continue to eke out the livelihood from these traditional informal spaces for its survival, and thereby also ensuring a continued reproduction of these spaces. And this is not simply an existence of the old informal non-capitalist spaces, but they're continuously regenerated through the growth process. And that hints towards the need to critically locate that how with the growth process, what are the dynamics through which this informality is continuously being recreated, and with this huge amount of precarity where people do not have a stable location and are continuously moving across these to derive their livelihood. This calls into question the imaginary of transition through the process of capitalist development, despite this high growth that India has been experiencing, which is what we want to center. Now, of course, with all of these processes, the very co-constitutive element of caste is something that is lost in the story, while we do see the reflections of it all through. And in one of the other works, again, that is being developed with Sneshish Bhattacharya, is exactly about identifying that both the transition towards wage employment as well as the possibility of transition out of these informal spaces is structured along caste line, wherein the possibility of informal, these non-capitalist small enterprises to transition towards bigger capitalist enterprises is highly segmented along caste lines in the way that we would expect, where marginalized caste groups are much less likely to make these transitions. And then for those who do make these transitions, of course, not for those who make these transitions, but those who are able to move from these non-capitalist segments towards wage employment, those from marginalized caste groups are much more likely to be in casual, informal wage employment, while those from the privileged caste backgrounds are much more likely to be in regular salaried sort of employment that have higher returns. So it's both this inclusion and exclusion that is structured along caste lines, and the interaction of those two dynamics is something that is much needed, and we're looking to explore more. Thank you so much. I'll end on that note.
Thank you very much. This is super duper presentation and a great topic. Let us open the floor for questions. If nobody asking, I'm going to ask the first question. Yes, I can ask the first question. Yeah, I can see that to support your theoretical assumption and establish the fact, you have heavily relied on the data. And of course, it's very extensive and prove your points. I was wondering how the state policies, which actually dictates the creation of social security, which is in turn kind of indicates whether a person is employed in a formal or informal sector, whether it's a part of your broader theoretical framework. I remember in one of the lectures of Professor Patnaik, which he gave, Prabhat Patnaik, and also Utsa Patnaik also later came, gave it to us on the YSL platform. They indicated that after the World War II, give me an example where a state is allowed to frame a comprehensive social security arrangement for its entire workforce. So their assumption was that neoliberal state capitalism, whatever we call it, nationalistic states, they are kind of actively and discourage the idea of setting off such mechanism via various means, international pressure and etc. So where you stand in your theoretical framework, if it matters at all for your theoretical frameworks, maybe it doesn't matter at all.
I think that's a fantastic question. It definitely matters a lot. So thank you for asking such on-point question. So basically, all right. So there are points where I think I would agree with the position of Professor Patnaik that you're talking about, and also ways in which I would depart from it. So first of all, just by way of ground clearing, of course, informal employment, let's say if we're talking about wage employment, the fact that there is absence of long-term contracts, and we're basically seeing even in Bangalore, people are protesting because they want to now increase the workday to 60, 70 hours, and we're seeing all, the big capitalists in India basically going like, oh, you should have a 7-day working week and those sort of things, which is quite interesting. So all of those are geared towards, and sorry, I mean, of course, some of that employment can be formal, but like all of that also geared towards easy hiring and firing, etc., has been this move towards informalization and precarization that we're seeing. within enterprises, I mean, one thing that I kind of just want to mention is that everything that is small and less than 10 total workers, even if they're registered with the government, etc., will be informal because they don't need to subscribe to any of the labor laws and stuff which you were talking about in terms of social security. Now, the point is, I agree that post Second World War, we've not really had a social security system that could have been promoted for the global South. And the idea that has existed is that, look, growth and development and markets should sort of take care of it. Of course, pre-70s and stuff, pre the rise of neoliberalism, there was a little more state intervention that existed in order to help certain things out, but now it's even more diluting. However, it is also not that the state hasn't taken care of this problem, and in fact, the state hasn't intervened. The state has intervened, I would say, in big ways, but of a different nature. And what is that different nature? That different nature is, if we think about the development policies by the World Bank, when we're talking about any sort of, like, even what is happening in our country and stuff, a lot of it comes now not in the form of, okay, we're going to provide good jobs with social security linked to it, but rather there's almost this thing, actually, jobs is not going to happen. Even if you look at International Labor Organization's decent work agenda, it's like we need to provide decent work no matter how, where you are, right? And so it's like that question of transition is almost given away. That, look, that is the path through which development and transformation would happen. And then the social security has to be linked with the fact that you're included in this capitalist wage labor relationship. And that is going to be the one through which social security is going to be provided. But where is state intervening? State is, in fact, intervening in big ways to provide these micro credit loans, to provide these small sector loans, to provide, you look at the entire RCT agenda of looking at small enterprises, it becomes one of like, okay, how do we provide them the basic minimum loan? Universal basic income, sorry, not universal, basic income or conditional cash transfers have become one of the big development policy today. And state is very much aligned to it in terms of doing it, because state is also not a, is not a distanced entity. State is the space of negotiation, and it also takes on different ways and forms. So when the development interventions are taking the sort of form that we are seeing today, that is precisely to be like, look, we can't really provide you wage employment and secure thing, but we're gonna give you enough such that you're able to do something with your small enterprises. Right. And to be fair, that it's not that always that the state is intervening in a really big role. And in fact, something that I've seen in one of my previous works is that the informal enterprises are able to persist. They don't wither away. They don't like die out simply. A lot of them might, but it's almost like as they continue to persist for many years, etc., there's no increase in their, income and productivity, etc., for most part. So as an entire set, even if some get withered away, new join, etc., this entire set. But whenever required, the state, the international institutions, and now very dominantly philanthrocapitalism does intervene to provide this sort of seed capital, to be like, okay, we're going to give you some of this and see that whether you're able to survive with it. These firms are not really able to grow, but in fact, what Sanyal would say is that all of these transfers that we see happening today can almost be seen as a way of governance of the poor. He calls it the welfarist governmentality. It's a governmentality, but of the welfarist kind, where you have to talk about small loans, transfers, etc., to ensure that you do not have a politically unsustainable population, because you need to provide them a little bit something in order to be able to subsist. And the sad part for our economy is that it is precisely through the growth process that this is being reproduced, that we've basically had a growth process where labor has not been absorbed. I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Arun, do you have any questions?
Yeah, first of all, I want to just second Satvik. Thank you, Surbhi, for this wonderful presentation. Very, very insightful, and been following your works, and kudos to all the decolonized movements and including the broad structural points that you mentioned. But I have just a remark, and I could be wrong also, in the sense that you're talking about a broad structural point, which is wonderful. But then you take an example from CMIE of 2017-19, and you talk about the informal, like the data says that the informal wage employment to the self-employment is the biggest transition. And I kind of doubt it's because of the nature of the data, because I don't know if you know this debate around the CMI data that has more urban component over time. And I suspect that that's a temporary transition that you see in that trajectory analysis, which in case is actually an urban phenomenon, heavily because the 8 periods that you're following is the data becomes more and more urban in nature, So I think that may be happening behind this, but I completely agree to that broader point that you made. But I also have a second question, which is not really connected to this, but it's more of my interest. And we are working with the IHTS 3 data now, and it's great to see that you work with IHTS 1, 2, and I understand that it's 40,000 households, but that means it's the same households that transition. And so you say this interesting thing that 65%, around 65% has moved out, and around 65% has moved in to that first category that you, and maybe that is a non-agricultural
Self-employed.
self-employed category. And that's a very interesting insight for me. I didn't know this. And B, where do you think, so IHDS is a more, I mean, I would say it's a more, it looks at a longer period. So which means, where do you see yourself, like in your predicted models, where you kind of see how much they would have earned if, or would have gone if, those kind of models you don't control for age. And I'm thinking whether this whole transformation that the Indian economy has moved out to, as we talk about the vulnerability related to caste, etc., but the age also intersect kind of this, because the people who were in the employment are completely out of it, because that's not a job. The jobs that are generated are not for those age groups anymore. And this is probably purely from my economic demography background that I am asking, probably. And I would like to know both of you, comments for both the questions. Yeah, good. Thank you again for that.
No, thank you, Aaron. I mean, again, very interesting questions, and a lot for me to also think about in some of this. So yes, the IHDS. So one thing that I want to say is that when I had done this in 2005-12 IHDS work, which is now already published in Degree of Development Economics, is like some of the questions that came up was like, what if it was a thing of that period, right? And by then IHDS 3 data has also not come out, and we kind of wanted to also understand labor market transition. So we were like, okay, let's look at what's happening in this most recent period as well. So in some way, I would also like to look at the two things as complements in terms of bringing about this point about these huge transitions that underlie the overall sort of stagnant structure of the Indian economy, which was sort of the main point that I wanted to get to. So in that sense, what we are seeing in IHDS versus what we are seeing in the CMI, I don't see them as irreconcilable results. But in terms of the urban bias, I completely take your point. And what we have tried to do in almost all the things is, so basically we've relied on so there's this one paper by Rosa Abraham and Anand Srivastava, which are trying to compare CMI with labor force survey, and where the difference lies. And what they basically find is that one of the big things about the components that we are interested in terms of employment, what they undercapture is women's employment. So that's why that's one of the, and they undercapture women in all employment categories, not in any one. So basically keeping that in mind, that is something that we basically saying that it should not systematically bias our results. And that's why we also actually don't do any gender comparison. We only keep gender as a control in whenever we are needed. because of this particular thing. So to the extent that there's underestimation for all of those employment transitions. So for the transition question, it should not make a difference. Similarly, for the income thing, again, I agree that because of this urban bias and other thing, the incomes are inflated. And then there's this paper by Amit Basole and Mrinalini Jha, which are again comparing labor force incomes with the CMI thing. And what they see is like there's sort of, again, an inflation everywhere, but relatively, the income in the employment categories are the same. So to take into account exactly those biases, we've sort of done all these checks to make sure that we're not capturing some of those potential things, because this relative employment stuff should remain consistent as it is. But in terms of to what extent this is going to continue and whether what we are seeing is just a time period thing, look, I 100% agree with you that 17 to 19, just like 2-year time period, is not going to be enough to tell us about a structural transformation story, right? So it'll be good to, as we get more data, we want to explore much more of this. But the idea was that if these are random time points that we are drawing people from, you would want to see at least some tendencies towards something which, if multiplied over multiple time periods, will become a longer term trajectory of the economy, right? And what becomes very striking is that the move towards formality is completely absent. So that stepping stone sort of argument that we have. So this movement from informal wage employment to urban, in fact, I would say that if the urban yeah, if there is this urban bias that we're talking about, because again, we're looking at both rural and urban areas combined in which this is happening. So if your argument is that, look, we're looking at the transition from urban to rural, which we might not be capturing, but if it is just about that within informal wage employment to self-employment, that should pretty much capture the major transitions that are there. I don't know if that's answering the question well, but
Now, what I was meaning is that I would assume that that transition or that story would have been much more prominent in the rural context. And
I see.
but given the data structure is urban biased, and the self-employment definition is basically you have, okay, you open up a shop and that's self-employment stuff. So that's not the story that you had in your theoretical part, is what I suspect, and maybe I'm wrong, but.
Sorry, just to clarify, what do you mean that's not the story I would have? The consistent self-employment is something that we like, at that being one of the dominant trajectories does exist, and that is something, right, we see across data sets, right?
Okay.
And the huge movement across wage and self-employment is something also that we do see as coming out. I mean, just so that we do see a lot of transitions that are happening across a lot of those. In terms of any other comparisons that we've done with regression analysis, we've controlled for a rural-urban distinction. But I take your point very well in terms of it'll be good to like also just distinguish that with rural versus urban to see whether these patterns actually differ between the two. So I'll take that on board and I'll include that exercise in our paper. So thank you for that comment. Last question about IHTS and age. Great point. I know Rosa Abraham is working on some of these things, not with the IHDS data, but on other things about the age cohort, how things have varied. She's working on the youth unemployment, employment for India report. And there, that is something that she's quite interested in figuring out. Since the IHDS, I am focusing on the households rather than labor. That's why I can't really control for age in that particular case. But you're absolutely right that there is that bias that is starting to emerge where earlier people could have more formal jobs because that was the structure. And now these good jobs are not being created. So I definitely think that's a project worth taking. And I'd be very keen to know about what you're getting to find from IHTS 3. Thank you.
Hello, can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
Soumya, and I'm a master's in economics student at the University of Hyderabad. And I love your work on decolonizing economics and identities in economics. Thank you very much for that. I'm also interested in identities in economics as part of my master's. So I have two questions for you today. How can we, integrate the role of local knowledge in economic policy making? For example, can you share examples where local economic knowledge has successfully influenced policy making, either in India or globally? And, what lessons can we draw from it? And the second question is on growing digitalization and its development of gig economy. So there are many arguments that gig economy democratizes work by lowering entry barriers and stuff like that. But we can obviously see that it reinforces traditional caste hierarchies. So how can we eradicate caste-based labor segmentation in gig economy, and what specific lessons from workers, movements, or organizations abroad can we learn and can we apply in India's context?
Thank you, Soumya. Really nice to meet you. And yeah, thank you so much for these questions. I'll start with the second one. And glad to know you're working on these issues, which are definitely much needed. In terms of the growing digitization aspect, and I absolutely agree that it's basically new forms in which precarity is being reproduced, right? And it's quite interesting because, these people are being celebrated. Oh, you're self-employed, you're your own boss, you can manage your own time and everything, right? But exactly what is happening is completely counter. You're basically under this constant surveillance, even if now not directly imposed on the factory floor, but rather through the algorithms, through your consumer ratings, etc. So there's one of the papers that we had written, which is called um, I forget what it's called now, but it was in development and change when we're looking at the world of work, basically. And that's where we kind of speak about exactly what is going on in terms of, if we want to understand from a Marxian political economy lens, what this sector really means. And yes, you're absolutely correct, because, there's so many aspects in which people have been arguing, oh, you can see caste inequalities in India to be going down in terms of income, in terms of educational attainment and stuff. But I think we also need to come out of that, just looking at fixed indicators to understand a process that is so evolving at every moment, right? That's morphing in every moment. So one also needs to think about what are the different ways through which social process of caste might be getting reproduced. And the whole idea was that with modernization, this would go away. These hierarchies would kind of stop to exist. But we are basically seeing that actually new forms of employment itself carry or import these sort of caste-based hierarchies in various different ways. And of course, then the way these mechanisms are then used to suppress wages, etc., is something that is a whole other thing. In terms of what lessons to draw from what is happening in the global north, I think Global South has to really lead the way in this, because we know informality much better than what Global North does. They sort of think about this as the future of works and new forms of employment relations, which is absolutely not true for the global majority of the world. So, but one thing that I would say is that it's actually been quite hard. Like in UK, there are people who've been organizing this work by Jamie Woodcock and others, which is quite interesting. And in one of the talks, he said that in fact, for example, Uber, etc., a lot of the people have been fighting to um, get certified as a worker so that they can actually go to labor laws as a recourse for when they're not paid well, right? But what they won this case in general about in the UK, so you can basically qualify to be a worker, but it's such a weak law where even if that legislation exists, every person will have to individually go and be like, actually, I don't want to be classified as a self-employed, but I want to be classified as a worker. So there's a huge legal baggage that comes with it. But also one thing that I think we all need to think about is that in a scenario where there's a surplus labor globally available, but capital is mobile, can we even think about these ways, which will be more domestically concentrated ways of organizing, to really cause a dent in the bargaining power when capital can simply just relocate elsewhere if it's not making enough profits in those sort of scenarios. And of course, the increasing workday, etc., is not going to help at all. So I don't have answers. I have more questions for you and more sort of, but I share the sort of angst that you have about it. About role of local knowledge in economic policy making, I would think about it, there's this two frames. One is like there's this huge thing now, particularly in UK and stuff, which I never experienced in India. There's this huge celebration of everything that's indigenous, which is not true, right? Like there's a lot of indigenous that is extremely bad, caste-based hierarchies, etc., that we know are like things that we want to get rid of completely. So we also, but what we want to invent is an alternate modernity that is sort of based in something that is not just an import of a Eurocentric vision, is how I would try to put it. So local knowledge, yes, we need to think about local knowledge of organizing, local knowledge of how digital workers. In fact, in Latin America, a lot of people have been talking about, an alternative information gathering platform, which allows Uber and cab drivers to get information on markets, etc., which can be used as an alternative and as sort of a market alternative to Uber and other sort of platforms. And those could be potential ways to think about organizing. And those are the aspects that I would probably bring into. I can talk a lot more about it, but I'm aware of the time. But hopefully that gives you a sense of it. But I'm happy to chat otherwise as well, Soumya.
Thank you very much for that, Surbhi. Your perspectives are really interesting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Abhishek, if you want to ask
Yeah,
anything.
Just a little question. That was again interesting presentation. So my question was basically like, if you want to like kind of theorize, I mean basically categorizing capital versus capitalism. So I mean, if wage labor is kind of a problematic to define uh, economies in global south, basically I mean mostly south asian economies and all. So if wage labor becomes sort of a problem in defining the capitalism, but you can define capital with I mean sort of non-capital and pre-capital is part and parcel of this whole uh, kind of a enclosure of I mean under totality of this capital. But if we are somehow I mean cannot define capitalism only using base labor, then how can somebody theorize alternate form of like in context of India and Bangladesh? I mean, everywhere you see that wage labor really is not very dominant. I mean, category, and even the logic of subsumption also fails on ground. Like if you see, I mean, your paper was on linkages and all. That is kind of a problematic. So what sort of I mean capitalism it is? I mean, no doubt, capital has kind of an abstract notion into it, and that can be kind of a process. There are multiple processes going on, but how will I mean someone can define capitalism in that way if there is sort of a that much kind of a heterogeneity and I mean churning going on in the labor market? So that was just a little question.
Thank you for this really fantastic question, and I think more work needs to be done on it, and I absolutely agree. And this has been a question that I started grappling on earlier on in my PhD, because we're like, okay, there's this, like 50% of India is actually outside any kind of wage labor relationships, and it's for a lot of them there's also not this we're also not talking about a real subsumption. So how do we characterize it? So I found some answers, of course, through my advisor, in the works of Resnick and Wolf, where capitalism for us is an economic system where the conditions of reproduction of the capitalist production process, capitalist production and labor process dominantly prevail. What do I mean by it? If we have a capitalist production process, and however we want, we can go into defining that, but let's say we agree on a definition of it. There, the idea is that be it the institutions of state, be it the institutions of, so just the conditions that are needed for a reproduction of a particular system is something that are most dominant. and are most available, be it private property right, be it in the way legal structure is, etc., which allows for a particular way of organizing production to be hegemonic. Now, the question then becomes, is what we are characterizing today capitalism? I would say yes, or both global and domestic form of it. And of course, one of the arguments that comes out of Kalyan Sanil's work that we are also trying to sort of take forward is precisely that capitalism in of itself always has been this differentiated totality. It has always had these heterogeneous production and labor processes, either on a global scale or on a domestic scale. And it is not something that can simply be the one logic that capital has is of expansion, but that doesn't mean that that expansion always needs all these labor and other spaces to be fully subsumed under its singular economic logic. And that is why capitalism cannot be defined only by this homogeneity of, when we talk about wage labor or how production surplus is produced, appropriated, and distributed, but rather allowing for all of these, there is still a hegemony of capitalist production and labor process. And how is this hegemony established? That is in about various economic, social, and political conditions which it needs for its economic reproduction, for its reproduction, they have to be dominantly prevailing in the social formation. I hope that answers the question. So, sorry, and the last part in terms of how do we think about alternative, we have to think about not just the economic, but also these other spheres to provide conditions for this other system to have its way of existence realized.
Yeah, thanks. But I mean, I was also like wondering this problem with, if you see that, no doubt, I mean, wage labor and this also like exploiting wage labor and all, it's also not very defining feature with this given heterogeneity. And then again, distribution and appropriation of surplus is also again fail on various grounds. So, I mean, somehow we need to like kind of maybe think about this what is this a specific context, especially in context of India, that I mean, no doubt there are multiple class processes going on, but I mean, uh, these are basically objects, and how we somehow make it a proper kind of a theoretically ground these heterogeneous things to say that this is how I mean exactly going on in this Indian capitalism or Indian capitalist development.
Yeah, I think fair point. And definitely in terms of what those conditions of reproduction is and how capitalist production process becomes hegemonic, I 100% agree with you, is a part of the most important question in this agenda that needs to be worked on a lot more. Thanks, Abhishek.
We are a little bit out of time, so I want to formally close it. After that, if Surbhi has time and you have time, you can chat a little bit further. So with that, Arun, do you want to add anything?
Oh, thank you. This is an excellent session. Thank you, Surbhi. Thank you, everybody. And
Thank you, Surbhi, for your time. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
very
Arun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With that, we are formally ending the session. Please feel free to spend 1 or 2 minutes more if you want to. With that, thank you very much, Surbhi. Thank you once more.
Thank you.
Thanks.